Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Tamanna Inamdar. Now, it's a battle of wills this week in corporate India. Bharat Feuds' Baba Kalyani is locked in a battle with his siblings over their mother's two wills. On the other hand, the hotel conglomerate Oberoi family too is battling it out in court over their father's will. But this is not the first time we're witnessing such family feuds, especially in corporate India. Lack of succession plans have plagued the bigwigs of industry for long, and not just succession plans. Dual wills, multiple versions, and of course, a lot of heirs in the fray. Take, for instance, the KK Modi family. Lalit Modi of IPL fame and his brother Sameer Modi are fighting their mother, Beena Modi, tooth and nail for the 11,000 crore rupee inheritance. Sameer Modi has even accused his mother of orchestrating an assault on him. Beena Modi, in turn, ousted Sameer from the board. The Kirloskar family too is facing internal squabbles. The sons Atul and Rahul Kirloskar have gone against their father Sanjay Kirloskar, attempting to take away control of the company from him. The Raymond family saga has played out in the public domain for quite some time. Gautam Singhania's father, Vijay Singhania, bitterly complained against his son after he handed over a 37% controlling stake to him in the company. As if this were not enough, Gautam's very bitter and ugly divorce with Nawaz Modi is playing out in the public domain. Not too long ago, brothers Mukesh and Anil Ambani had famously split the Reliance empire between them as well. Subsequently, of course, they've made peace and now have planned a succession for the next gen. Now, with battles brewing everywhere over succession and inheritance today, what we are trying to do on The Big Story is understand why we have this kind of acrimony time and again in some of the largest Indian corporate families. And let's be honest, this is not a problem only with large Indian corporate families. It happens a lot in business families, it happens a lot in Indian business families. So the question we're asking today really is, how do you ensure as a successful promoter that there is a succession plan in place that doesn't turn into a feud? How do you preserve legacy for the next generation? And what do you do if a family feud breaks out like it sometimes and invariably does? To speak on this, I'm joined today by author and thought leader and the former CEO of Procter & Gamble India, Gurcharan Das. With me also is Executive Director of Catalyst Advisors, Binoy Parekh, who has a lot of experience on advising large business families. So welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Absolute pleasure speaking with you. Mr. Das, let me begin with your commentary on the kind of feuds we've seen in the last couple of weeks, or in the last few days actually. There are two that I mentioned at the start of the show, and I'm not sure you want to go into specific details, but what is very similar between the feud in the Kalyani family and the Oberoi family is the existence of two wills. Two versions of who gets what, to put it very simply. Is this a problem that we see very, very often?
Well, before I answer the reality question, let me take a pause and say, what should be the ideal that a business family should strive for? Well, it should, in the first generation, the person makes money. The next generation has the money. They don't want more money, but they want power. So they become MPs, ministers, etc., and they leave the business to professionals, and they are on the board of their inheritance. The third generation has money, has power. They don't want more money and power. So what do they want? Maybe they want art. The third generation becomes a writer, artist, violinist, or whatever. And of course, stays on the board of the company, which is run by professionals. Okay, this is kind of the way I think how it should be, an ideal way for a family. And in fact, this is a story of Buddenbrooks, which is a German novel of Thomas Mann, which won a Nobel Prize. Anyway, now to your reality. Reality is, of course, that business should not be interrupted at all in these family feuds. And therefore, the lesson is that the quickly turn the company over to professionals, unless you have an outstanding son or daughter, and then only the son and daughter should earn the compensation for what they're doing through salary, through stock options, etc. But when it comes to wills, when it comes to the family, um, when it comes to the family business, the inheritance, then it should be equal and it should be very transparent. It's like, every mango seller loves and thinks all his mangoes are equally sweet.
Okay. So that's of course part of it, that family wills make it messy. But I want to come to the current sort of feuds that we have seen, and let me come to Binoy on it without speaking specifically about any one family or any one thing. But Binoy, the question of varying wills and varying versions. Now, this is where it gets tricky, and just let's come to the nuts and bolts of it. What happens when there are two versions of who gets what? And in the case of the Oberoi family, it's not even the same person. One section of the family is claiming the will left by the grandfather, that is P.R.S. Oberoi's father, saying that he's merely a trustee. And this happens very often in especially Hindu law, where the next generation, the grandchildren, are the true inheritors, and the parent is the trustee. On the other hand, you have one side of the family that is claiming P.R.S. Oberoi's will. Now, do you see this often, and how do you ensure that a will, if it's changed, there is agreement on all parties on what is the finality of it?
Sure. So I think a couple of things over here. And in most of the cases that we've seen, the longevity of time, that is clearly a problem, because, all these things are written way back. The understanding in the family must have been oral. And the understanding would have been between a couple of members where all the family members were not aligned. And therefore, the problem is really that, as time passes, memory fades. And therefore, you would have various versions of the understanding that people will have, different parts of the family will have. So the way we've really seen is that lots of these disputes, they arise mainly on account of the fact that today the families have become much more complex, and on top of it, or side by side maybe, there is a complex wealth mix, and large part of the assets are represented by financial assets, which are shares in operating companies, and that's where the real battle lies. And so I think, in order to have a seamless succession, really, you should have the buy-in of all the family members, write it down in a particular manner through a family arrangement, so that there is no two ways about it when it comes for execution. And not only the management, but the governance of these companies is seamless, and the wealth, of course, is seamlessly passed to the next generation.
Okay, so that is the case when there is a will. Sometimes there is no clear will, and that's when it gets very, very tricky. Now, there are also changes in law over time, which then start including, now most recent changes in law also include female heirs, and they have now come to the fore. So, let me come to you, Mr. Das, from the point of view of what should a business family do? When is it the right time to have the succession plan in place so as to avoid feuds? If it's too early, you might have a situation like you have in one case that we mentioned earlier, where the son has pushed out the father, or that's what the father feels, that maybe he handed over the reins too early.
Well, all human beings feel they're going to live forever. And so this is the problem that has just been pointed out by Binoy, that they just don't do succession planning. And the first rule of succession planning is to have a will which is transparent, with an executor, and actually everybody's informed in advance of what the will contains. And the fair thing is to give everybody an equal share including the women. And that's the right way. And if somebody feels, that this one son contributed to 80% of this empire, well, that son doesn't. It's not through the will that you pass on. It is through the company that that young person built up, that who created 80% of the assets. He should be compensated through salary, stock options, of that company. But as far as the family is concerned, it should be fair. It's like a communist system when it comes to succession. Everybody, the mother loves all her children equally. And that's the simplest way, I would say. And the earlier you do it, the better. Uh, I mean, this is an abdication of responsibility, I'm afraid, of the previous generation, when the next generation has to go into litigation and fighting and all that. You've just not done your job as a proper, decent human being.
No, that's an important point. I mean, that point from Gusharan Das, it's an abdication of responsibility of the previous generation if there ends up being a feud. That means you've not fulfilled your responsibility. But then, that comes back to the question of how soon is too soon. What if the next generation does not give you your due? And we've seen that in some cases where the first generation, or the parent generation, for lack of a better word, feels that they got pushed out too early. Binoy, that question for you?
Yeah. So, the best time of a succession plan is yesterday, is what I feel. But it cannot be like an all or none situation, because one size doesn't fit all. So today you may have a small family and you may not need a very, very cohesive succession plan. Maybe you can start off with a family charter where, the understanding, the family ethos, the values will be captured in this family charter. It's basically like a letter of wishes where the main person in the family will write that, how the companies, how the families should be governed. Maybe the next step is the succession of assets. The first and foremost step for that is a will. And, a combination of succession of governance and succession of assets will be through probably a memorandum of understanding. Or if you want to go all the way, then you can have family trusts which capture succession of management, succession of governance, decision making within the active assets, because you don't want to mess the operating companies, as Mr. Das was mentioning earlier, and succession of assets, of course. And within this fold, you could have certain active members of the family, certain passive members of the family. And while the succession of assets could be equal or more so equitable, I would think that, for example, passive family members, they should have security that their lifestyle will be maintained despite, moving on to a formal succession plan.
Okay, so now so far we've spoken from the point of, say, the patriarch or the matriarch, right? The Gen 1, so to speak, who should be making a will, should be doing it in time, should be having no ambiguity, how they should reward different members of the family and ensure there's no acrimony after them. Let's turn the table and think of it the other side, Binoy, and I'll come to you on that. What if that has not been done for whatever reason? The person has passed away interstate. There is lack of clarity, there is more than one will, a dispute is brewing, then there is a challenge in court, and some of the details that come out when you see these big business family feuds are truly ugly, with a claim to the extent of saying that, you have influenced the mother to write the will that you are claiming is yours. It gets fairly ugly. So now, Binoy, what should someone do if they find themselves in this situation with their family members?
So, see, I mean, from a Hindu law perspective, especially, it's very complex, because you not only have a set of personal assets, but you have something which is called as a Hindu undivided family. Now, this is a concept very peculiar to India. And the reason is that the genesis of HUF is basically that there was a nucleus, and the wealth which was created from the first generation is then divided across all the co-partners, which is basically the family members. And that's where it really gets messy, that what is the distinction between personal assets and maybe HUF assets. Now, coming to your question, that what should one do in this situation is, of course, understand. See, the first and foremost thing before going to the court of law is always, it's always a good idea to sit with the family members, understand what are their objectives, what is their pain point, what do they want. And the first and foremost thing before any legal battle starts is to have an amicable settlement, because you don't want dirty linen to come out in the public. So I think the first and foremost is to have an inter se amicable settlement, amicable discussions, etc. Failing which, you could have an advisor who can mediate and is trusted by all the family members, and they'll listen to them. So you can go for mediation. And if none of these routes work, of course, the only answer then would be a messy legal battle, which consumes your time, energy, and if somebody is young, then his or her youth.
Um, in your experience, Binoy, and without taking names, what has been the toughest part of bringing families together to the table?
See, what has happened is that if lots of years have passed, it's always a battle of what was not said rather than what was said. So the problem is that when, let's say, after decades, you come together on a table, a lot of these things which were not spoken of will not be spoken of in such detail when you are trying to settle. I mean, it always takes two to tango, right? So whenever there's a family, if one party is not willing to bend, then the other party, no matter how he or she tries, it will always be difficult. And that's where the communication gap, that's where the lack of trust, I think, would be the key basis or key facets where we've seen that this lack of trust, gap in communication over years, etc. I mean, that's something that we've seen is the toughest when it comes to arriving at a common ground.
Mr. Das, just any anecdotal experience that you can share from your stint and watching corporate India so closely. What seems to be the biggest issue when it comes to these family feuds, the trigger, and how do they find resolution? Because some of them are stuck in courts for decades.
Yeah. Well, most of my concern has been to ensure that the companies don't suffer as a result of the fighting between siblings, etc. And so that has been, to me, the most important thing is that it's a good idea to have a family office. Binoy mentioned the family advisor. Well, a family office with a good advisor really is a very good way to go about it. The critical thing is that it's best to keep family members out of the business. That I'm again addressing the question of that the business should not suffer. In other words, in an institution in other words, capitalism should not get a bad name because families are fighting. And so I haven't dealt so much in the area that Binoy has, where you get into this messy business in the family. But if you have a good family advisor, if you begin talking, have the family members attend meetings of the family office, then they also have a kind of a joint shared stake in everything in the decision making, and that's I mean I would think just talking and starting early in the process is a good idea. And as I said, the best principle is to divide equally. And if someone has made a bigger contribution to creating the business, let that person be compensated by the company which he or she has built through stock options and salary. My worry has been that too many family businesses have put nephews into their business who were incompetent, and the business professionals were not happy. In such a case, the business underperformed. So I was really concerned about performance, and I was concerned that that business, the companies should not suffer. So I'm not so good. I'm not sure I'm the right person to give you advice when things get into a fight
Well, let me
in
take
the family.
that forward then, Mr. Das. How do you ring fence the business? I mean, you're saying that hire professionals to run it, but all families may not be able to, and maybe not
Well,
at the top level. That's
yeah,
when the
but
nephews come in.
yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that's the temptation that you try and put family members into, give them jobs in the company. And one should just resist that temptation because you're creating an enterprise which is going to go on for generations. And I think this is a very important lesson for business people to learn, to internalize. Too many families have failed because the next generations were not competent, and it should be a rule. I mean, the reality is, look, you've got one brother or who's good, another brother who's bad, and you want to behave equally with them. And the reality is that there'll be a fight. So just keep both of them out of the family. Encourage them to start their own enterprises and show their own sort of mettle. That's really the right way to go. Keep family members out of the running institutions.
Keep
That's
family
what.
members out of the family business. That is
Yeah, keep
that is
exactly.
that,
That should be the
that is
rule.
the antithesis of every Indian family business. In fact,
Well,
the moment there is a business, you start looking for family members to bring them in.
yeah. So that exactly. That's the original sin, if you will.
Okay,
That
Binoy, your take on this. How do you ring fence the business? And I mean, you might not. Every business is not of the scale that you go find a professional CEO.
So, yes, you're right, absolutely right. See, India, in a way, operates differently because today what happens is that the family members who are very active, they know the entire ecosystem of how the family business was built in the first place. Now, to have that professional management suddenly, it could be a transition. It could be maybe over 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, once you've reached that scale. But today, the incentive for a family to be a part of a family business is that they are creating value for the family, and nobody else, unless it transforms into an institution, nobody else would really have that incentive or motivation. And across ecosystem, for example, be it your lenders, be it bankers, be it financiers, vendors, customers, etc., there's a lot of personal goodwill of the family backing the family business which is there. So I, for example, if I was a banker, I would get very um, anxious if a family member is totally out of action. And because I'd say that, okay, what's in it for the professional management to be for a family business? And I'm not talking about institutions, let's say like HDFC or something, which is an institutionalized setup. But a family business, especially your medium-sized businesses, small businesses, there's a lot of personal credibility, a lot of personal goodwill attached to that, and therefore, the presence of family members who run a family business, at least till the time you achieve a scale, I think it's very necessary in my view.
Okay, so the presence of the family members is important till it achieves scale, says Binoy. Gusharan Das says, keep family out of the business. How do we resolve this, Mr. Das?
Well, I this is where I disagree with Benoit. The fact of the matter is that when you create an institution, you are not creating it for your family. You are creating it for the overall society. And this is where you've got to stop and say that when you say this company is mine, that's where the problem occurs. You are a member of a society, of a nation, or whatever, and it's an institution that you are creating, and it's going to be bigger than yourself. So I would suggest a little bit of humility. And frankly, a banker or whoever judges a company not by the family member running it, but by the performance of the company. And surely there are umpteen. If you have to choose for the best person, you think that person will come out of one family? There are thousands of young MBAs coming up with great aspirations, with great experience in companies, in startups, in large companies. Surely, if you go for a bigger universe, you have a much better chance of getting the best. And also in the professional company, a professional manager is as responsible as a family member. You have to remember, a family member can be led astray by a lot of family considerations rather than considerations of the institution. And I think we've got to change that mindset. Now, it's not easy because you do feel, after all, it's my family's business. Well, my family's business means that I get on the board of the company and make sure that the best person in the country is available to run it. And I'm not saying maybe for a startup family business, give it some time, give it a little bit of scale, but this should be the way that family businesses have to run. They have to run by the best person think of it, the best persons should run the company, and to think that there are hundreds and thousands of best persons outside who are much better than one family member. Why must a family member think that
I
he is or
agree,
she
but
is a natural
I agree if
successor?
it's a large company, but depends on the scale of the company. I mean,
No, but it's a mindset. It's a
yeah.
mindset
You're a
question.
custodian. You're a custodian of the wealth
Yes,
that you're
yes,
creating.
absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And there are such fine, outstanding people who will have just as much loyalty, as much as ownership, if they're made to feel that the business will not go to a nephew who's incompetent afterwards. Who
Kusharandas is
wants to
very
work in such a
upset with
company?
his nephew situation, but no, but I get your point. I get your point. It's complicated. I suppose it has to be very specific, but the basics need to be in place. And the number one of those basics definitely is that have clarity. Have clarity so that you don't have a situation where your next generation is fighting over your version of a will after you pass away. I guess that's the big lesson, and it's one that corporate India keeps learning again and again. We'll probably see more instances of this sooner rather than later. But for now, thank you so much, Kusharandas and Binoy Parikh, for joining us on The Big Story.